Thanks to everyone for being here, for showing up, and of course I certainly want to thank the Martindale family for making my job possible. Also want to sort of just put it out there that especially after hearing this wonderful biography of Dr. Martindale, that I could only aspire to be half as productive and frankly half as provocative as Dr. Martindale was, and so I've got big shoes to fill. I do, before I start, I do want to, just as a note of caution, for those of you who are environmentalists, I am going to be making some critical remarks about environmentalism and the environmental movement. But lest you think that I'm straying from the path, I want you to know that I fully support the cause of environmentalism. And indeed, I've been unwavering in that support. And the only time in recent memory, perhaps, when I could say to have been sort of falling off that wagon would have been a recent morning this past February when it was negative 27 below zero, and I was walking my poor corgi through my neighborhood, and I found myself praying feverishly for global warming to accelerate. So outside of that, I'm solid 100%. So I do want to dedicate my remarks today to Ms. Hazel Johnson, who's a great charismatic environmental justice leader, activist in South Chicago, founder and executive director of the organization People for Community Recovery. And in so many ways, she gave me my first shot, got me started in this business, and has been a mentor ever since the beginning, probably my second week of graduate school. So Hazel, this is for you. So in this talk, I want to do two things. I want to explore 2 points and ask, I guess, 2 questions. Hope you guys can see this okay. The first is to ask how race matters in environmental politics and policy. The second is to ask how race matters in social movements, particularly those responding to environmental policies, and particularly those environmental policies that are believed to have caused harm to communities of color, or what we'd call environmental racism. Environmental sociologists researching the disproportionate environmental burdens that communities of color in the United States and globally have confronted have generally done so using sophisticated statistical methods to reveal these disparities, again, environmental inequality or environmental racism, or have used case study methods to understand how these inequalities unfold in context. And while both approaches are critical to understanding the phenomenon of environmental racism, the extent of theorizing race in this literature is either absent or has largely been limited to invocations of institutional racism in federal, state, and corporate policies. And certainly I concur with many of those conclusions, but what I want to do today is to insist on a much more dynamic understanding of race, particularly as it relates to environmental politics. So that's a task for environmental sociology. With regard to social movement theory, I remain surprised that there appears to be little attempt among scholars in this field to engage with theories of race, since so many of the social movements that sociologists study are often fundamentally about racial justice. And this work, in my opinion, reveals that the kinds of things that we social movement scholars obsess about, such as collective action frames, mobilizing structures, movement cultures, political opportunity structures, these things are in fact deeply racialized. So this presents us with an opportunity not to dispense with social movement theory or environmental sociology, as some post-colonial and cultural studies scholars have unfortunately done, but rather to introduce and deepen an analysis of racial dynamics within existing sociological frameworks. So this talk comes from a slice of my book of the same title. And I gathered data for this study between 1998 and 2006. And I draw on several research methods, archival and content analysis of a range of documents, interviews with leading environmental justice and human rights activists in various parts of the world who are really central to the development of global environmental justice networks, but also participant observation. I attended, participated in, and frankly organized a number of national and international conferences and gatherings on issues of human rights and global environmental justice, therefore allowing me easier access to these participants for interviews and various discourses and other documents. But this study is also, as was referenced earlier, part of a broader program of public sociology and advocacy research, which crudely, in my opinion, is an effort by scholars to produce research that may be accessible to, or at least partly in service of, the people we write about and for the general public. So let me talk about this thing that we call the environmental justice movement. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, working class communities of color across the United States began to rise up against the disproportionate dumping, the disproportionate location of municipal, corporate, and hazardous waste sites in their backyard, highlighting the problem of domestic environmental racism. But since the 1980s, environmental racism associated with the siting of garbage dumps and exports of hazardous waste has also become a routine transnational practice. And so the rise of the transnational environmental justice movement is a grassroots response to that reality. Some of the many toxic threats facing these communities, or maybe one of them, are pesticides. So let's skip across the Atlantic and go to the continent of Africa, which is a place that has been documented as a site. Every single nation, virtually every single nation, has been documented as a site hosting obsolete pesticide waste stockpiles. A waste stockpile, a pesticide stockpile, becomes obsolete after 2 or more years, begins to corrode the 55-gallon drum in which it's generally contained, and is then believed to pose a risk to public health or the ecosystem. Experts estimate that the volume of obsolete pesticides on the continent of Africa somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 tons, and the cleanup effort is believed to will take upwards of $200 million US. So the following is a case study, which is one of countless examples of the struggle over the dumping of pesticides in Africa. And this takes us to Maputo, Mozambique, the capital city, and the year is 1998. One day, community activist Janice Lemos read a story in the newspaper about Danida, which is the Danish development agency, or aid agency. Danida was funding an effort to locate an incinerator in the southern city of Matola, an incinerator that would burn 900 tons of obsolete toxic fertilizer and pesticide stocks at a cement factory that had just been left over. And we can find these, as you saw on the previous slide, virtually anywhere on the continent, and certainly outside of Africa as well. This aid agency, Danida, sought to donate this hazardous waste facility that would literally burn this waste. That's how they were going to treat it. So Janice Lemos began organizing her community. She eventually called Greenpeace International's headquarters in the Netherlands, where someone informed her that 2 US-based activists, anti-incineration activists, were going to be visiting South Africa the following month. And if she would be so nice as to invite them to come up to Mozambique, they would do so. So, with the help of Greenpeace and Oxfam, Janice Lemos and fellow concerned residents brought U.S. anti-incinerator activists Annie Leonard and Dr. Paul Connett, who's a chemistry professor at St. Lawrence University, and Bobby Peake, who is a toxics expert from the South African organization Environmental Justice Networking Forum. It was a shot of the actual pesticides in Matola. So these visiting activists were quite concerned. They were quite concerned because they had actually had documentation that cement kiln incineration, which was the kind of incineration that had been proposed here, produces a range of deadly toxins, including furans and dioxins. Dioxins, as many of you no doubt know, are believed to be the most toxic substance known to science. So this is no joke. But few people in the capital city of Maputo or in the southern city of Matola had heard anything about this project from Danida. In fact, the foreign visitors from South Africa and the United States were the only people at the meeting who had even seen or possessed a copy of the rather thin environmental impact statement that Danida had prepared. Interestingly, this report was written in English. Anybody tell me what the problem might be there in a country like Mozambique? The official language of Mozambique is not English, it's Portuguese. And so, one activist remembered, quote, "Only a few of us could even manage to read the report and do a brief analysis," end quote. Professor Connett, the chemist, denounced the entire project. He says, quote, "In the US or Canada, those proposing a new toxic waste facility would be obliged to fully discuss all of the alternatives, all of the risks, and would have been required to hold several public meetings and hearings before decisions could be made about a particular disposal method. The environmental assessment and public involvement in this project is a sham, end quote. So Dr. Conant points out what has now become a classic double standard for environmental assessments in communities of color, in poor communities and indigenous communities, many places around the globe, including, sadly, the United States, where risk assessments are often of poor quality and produced in languages other than those spoken locally. Mauricio Sulilla, one of the local community leaders from Maputo, who was present at the meeting, later told a reporter, quote, "When we explained to people at the gathering that the government had decided that the factory would burn toxic waste, they became terrified," end quote. What's interesting is Sulilla and others had already suspected that there were toxic materials at the site because during an earlier flood season in the area, residents were actually pumping water into a nearby swamp off of the site and off of their land, where soon afterwards, according to Sulilla, quote unquote, someone ate a fish caught in the swamp and they died, end quote. DANITA, the Danish International Aid Agency's assessment, however, was that there were no significant risks associated with the incinerator project. So here, this isn't just people competing on a material, a structural, and political basis. This is competing forms of knowledge about who has the legitimate understanding and the right to essentially impose that understanding and have that understanding be more visible and take root in this community. At this meeting with U.S. and South African activists and local residents and community leaders, people decided that we needed to create a new organization. So Mr. Mazul, one of the attendees, who was also an artist, explained that since the citizens had been kept in the dark, as he put it, by Mozambican and Danish authorities, their new group should be named Lingo, which translates to all that sheds light in the local Shangaan language. Mauricio Sulilla was appointed the group's general secretary, and Janice Lemos and her sister Annabella joined the group's leadership as well. Soon thereafter, Lingo grew in its influence at the local and national government scale, and they took on this case of pesticides with great determination. They organized public gatherings and meetings with local residents and business leaders and made strategic use of the independent press. They held some of the first public demonstrations in post-conflict Mozambique. Sulilla explained, "It's important to say that Lingo was the first organization in Mozambique to really challenge the government." Now, of course, Portugal had colonized Mozambique for going on 5 centuries. They had independence in the 60s, then a bloody civil war that ended sometime in the early 90s, 1992. So this is just a short time after this. And Lingo was really responsible for opening up civil society, but the environmental justice issue was the issue that allowed that to happen. Lingo was actually able to hire another firm to do an independent environmental assessment of the project. Annabella Lemos proudly recalled that, quote, "Their conclusion was completely what we thought from the beginning. Under no condition should the cement factory be turned into an incinerator," end quote. However, the government refused, not surprisingly, to consider this independent assessment. Again, competing forms of knowledge. Lingo then tried to get an audience with the Danish embassy in the capital city of Maputo. They were refused there. Then they collaborated with Greenpeace Denmark, who flew members of this organization up to Denmark to make a petition to the Danish parliament to address the crisis. Minimal success there. So they continued to pressure governments in both Mozambique and Denmark at all levels, and of course, getting the story out into the international press. And although Lingo activists were only recently beginning civil society organizing on environmental justice issues, they were familiar with the problem of environmental inequality, since this is something that has been widespread in the region of southern Africa. Annabella Lemos remarked, quote, "In South Africa, for example, always the dumping sites are near the poor people. And we have a dump here, a waste dump here in the city, and there is a concentration of poor people there. So it's the same thing here. The poor, they always get the waste," end quote. So after 2 years of campaigning locally and nationally, Lingo had its first victory. The Mozambican government agreed to what the activists had demanded, which was a return to sender arrangement. and allowed the chemicals to be shipped back to a global north nation. Not Denmark, but the Netherlands, which actually has a really good capacity for processing and disposing of hazardous waste there. And while the external resources of various international organizations were certainly critical to this campaign, these local activists claimed that it was their level of determination and commitment to the struggle is what ultimately sustained the effort. As Lingo's Aurelio Gomez remarked, quote, "We have nothing against the nation of Denmark, and I hope they have nothing against us. But we just want them to understand that here in Mozambique, while we may not be wealthy, we will never compromise our health. That is all that some of us actually have," end quote. So Lingo was struggling against a case of international environmental inequality, where arguably excessive volumes of highly toxic pesticides were exported by northern corporations, nations, and aid agencies to a population that is largely poor, non-European. And so rather than being colorblind, these entities have pushed these poisons on these communities because it is both possible and profitable to do so, and increasingly difficult to do so elsewhere. As many of you know, one of the theoretical frameworks that I've been drawing on for much of my work comes from German sociologist Ulrich Beck. His work on the risk society. In the risk society, Beck argues that we see a transformation in the relationship among the state, capital, civil society, and the environment. That is, we witness in this era of late modernity an exponential increase in the production and use of hazardous chemical substances. These practices emanate from the state and industry to civil society through production, consumption, and disposal regimes, elevating the level of social and physical risk to scales never before imagined. And speaking of scales, the y-axis is obviously missing here. The values, this was the best I could do digitally, I found in a report. I have another non-digital version of this, but I was too lazy to get it together. This is the global production rate of synthetic chemicals. And so we see this going from 1915, where the level of production of synthetic chemicals was somewhere around 100 kilograms, to 1988, or maybe right before 1988, where the level of production globally of synthetic chemicals was 100 billion kilograms, 220 billion pounds. After 2000, it actually jumped to well over that, somewhere on the order of 270 billion pounds. It's a lot of stuff. So Beck, it's not just a theory, points out that the politics of distribution of environmental degradation favor more powerful communities over others, which, of course, is the basis of the environmental inequality thesis. Thus, advanced capitalism for Beck creates wealth for some and imposes risks on others, at least in the short term. In the long run, this problem of widespread global ecological harm, however, returns to impact its creators in a boomerang effect. That is, according to Beck, the risks of late modernity eventually haunt those who originally produced them. This generalization of risks, unlimited in time or space, is apparently experienced by all persons, all groups, across divides of class, race, gender. Examples include skin cancers associated with ozone depletion and the health problems that result from exposure to pesticide residues. So in that sense, Beck acknowledges environmental inequality in the short term, while also maintaining a global long-range view of what, in his opinion, becomes a sort of democratization of risk. Of course, in the case of the pesticides in Mozambique, these toxins became a boomerang in that they were returned by force, rather than through the natural ecological processes that might cycle and circulate chemicals globally. So where does race fit into this story? Well, for well over a century, the use of words like poison and toxic has been common in writings by scholars and activists about race and racism. This is a powerful and, I believe, productive way to capture the harm that racism does to both its targets and its beneficiaries. Racism is often defined as those practices or ideas and discourses exercised by one group over another that results in the production and maintenance of dominance and privilege. And of course, what's really smart about that is when you can do that and make it appear to be perfectly natural. But complicating this view, we have scholars like Cornel West, George Lipsitz, Felix Cohen, and many others who've described racism as a paradox in the United States, as a poison that reveals deep contradictions and tensions that have periodically erupted into violence, revolts, and wars over the years. Critical legal and critical race theorists Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres make use of this terminology as well in their book, The Miner's Canary, which students in my graduate seminar should have read by now. We're going to be discussing this tomorrow. Guinier and Torres introduced the concept they term political race, which encompasses the view that race matters because racialized communities provide the early warning signs of a social poison in the atmosphere. So Guinier and Torres' concept of political race pushes us to challenge racism in all of its toxicity, if you will, because it threatens us all, not just people of color who may be its most direct targets. The great human rights activist Frederick Douglass once stated that racism is a poison that literally fills the air, but it also fills the water and the land, figuratively and literally, and invades our bodies like the chemicals that companies manufacture and pump into our atmosphere every day. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King once famously declared, quote, "White America is still poisoned by racism, which is as native to our soil as sagebrush, pine trees, and buffalo grass," end quote. Here King contentedly points out, or contends, excuse me, that racism is not just a poison that's harming white communities, but it's harming all of us. It's harming white communities as it simultaneously devastates communities of color. So these scholars and leaders view racism as a toxic in the metaphorical sense, but I want to add to that a much stronger attention to the literal, the structural, and material aspects of racism's toxicity. I also want to underscore that industrial toxics, these things on the previous slide, are a social force in their own right. Now, I initially defined toxics, if you're wondering, in roughly the same way the federal government does. As of 1976, with the RCRA, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, these hazards are defined as those chemical agents that have the potential to do public health and ecological harm. But as a social force, toxic chemicals can actually become the embodiment of and do the work of racism. They can actually do the work of class violence and gender violence because they are often intended to produce benefits for some while their manufacturers and managers often knowingly let them do harm to others. But in the end, of course, according to the Beck theory, the risk society thesis, we are all damaged to one degree or another. Guinier and Torres' poison or toxic metaphor for racism then nicely parallels Beck's risk society model in many ways, including the idea that racism, like toxics and other ecological hazards, might follow a boomerang pattern. This also echoes sociologist Avery Gordon's thesis in her book Ghostly Matters, that injustices of the past can continue to haunt the present, and that we as sociologists must be attentive to seeing such social figures and social forces that are not always readily visible. So in that spirit, the following is an exploration of the ways in which toxins and racism may operate and cooperate. Racism and toxics can, of course, maim, debilitate, and kill their victims. They are both used to shape the earth and its landscapes, literally and figuratively. Example, racist language and symbols have given us the dark continent of Africa and the Orient, the Middle East, South Asia, Asia. While at the same time, toxic waste has done untold physical harm to those same landscapes. Racism and toxics are simultaneously invisible and blatant, sort of the postmodern condition. An example, racist language and imagery in popular and scientific media have cast the bodies of people of color as inferior, prone to crime, oversexed and unclean, while toxics have physically deformed and debilitated countless persons of color in communities inundated with pollution. They are also used to shape bodies literally and figuratively, as I've just stated, but in the case of toxics, with the naked eye, we can actually observe 55-gallon drum barrels of pesticides. We can actually observe oil slicks. We can actually observe mine cavities. we can actually observe incinerators and garbage dumps. But the chemicals that are often associated with these practices are often colorless, often odorless, and often undetectable to the human senses. A postmodern condition. Racism and toxics both migrate through space over social and political borders, often across social borders through class, gender, and culture. For example, as is well known, the US-led war in Vietnam saw the commingling of racial ideologies with the export, well, the dumping, the bombing of hazardous chemicals such as napalm, Agent Orange, and dioxin. Vietnam is the single most bombed country in human history. These toxins migrated across national borders to do violence against both nature and human bodies in a unified project. Racism and toxics don't just migrate through space, they migrate through time, traveling across and impacting multiple generations, intensifying what scientists call bioaccumulating throughout networks of interdependence. An example. Toxic waste and hazardous materials can sit for decades in barrels, in ponds, and in vacant lots, and may take years to have a measurable impact on human populations from an epidemiological standpoint. Let's get specific. The mercury used during the gold rush, the California gold rush, 150 some odd years ago, continues to bioaccumulate throughout the food chain. What do I mean? If we go in 2009, today, to the San Francisco Bay, turns out that 75% of the people who are fishing the bay for a supplemental or a subsistence food are people of color, are immigrants, are refugees. These are people who are ingesting fish contain high levels of mercury brought to them courtesy of the California gold rush. So that's toxics. Racism, for its part, also leaves legacies and residues that can fester within individuals, families, populations, nations, as evidenced in the continuing conflict in my neck of the woods. I'm a Southern man from Tennessee. The continuing conflict over the meaning of the Confederate flag. Still haven't gotten over that. And the continued conflicts over the meanings of genocide in places like Turkey and Armenia, Iraq, the US, Australia, Kosovo, Rwanda, decades, sometimes centuries after the fact. These social forces shape consciousness, they shape political alliances, they shape national borders and life chances, as well as the very landscapes upon which people live and depend. Racism and toxics both constitute what sociologist Joe Fagan calls societal waste, social waste, in that they reflect an unnecessary and destructive expenditure of societal energy and wealth. They both provide privatized benefits to certain people, certain institutions and communities, while imposing, publicizing costs on others. And as I've stated earlier, they both can operate like a boomerang and circle back to haunt all of us, all members of society. And to close this exploration on a positive note, racism and toxics can be powerful tools for organizing resistance movements and for bringing people together across social and spatial boundaries. Happens every day. This is what I'm talking about. So this exercise, in my opinion, helps facilitate the work of rethinking both racism and toxics as social forces with far-reaching effects on societies and ecosystems. So let me ground this discussion in the context of the global waste trade. Since the end of World War II, industrialized nations, or what we call the global north, wealthier nations, have generated increasing volumes of hazardous chemical wastes, the result of technological developments, some would call them advancements, I wouldn't, across several industry sectors, and of a culture of increasing acceptance of risk in late modernity. Today it's estimated that nearly 3 million tons of hazardous waste from the United States and other global north nations cross international borders each year. Of the total volume of hazardous waste produced worldwide, 90% of it originates in the global north, much of which is then shipped to nations in the global south, the Caribbean, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Now there are many drivers of the waste trade, and I'm going to briefly touch on 4 of them. The first I've already discussed, and that is the exponential increase in the production of hazardous waste but that combined with the emergence of more stringent environmental regulations in northern nations. And this is one of the unfortunate and understudied legacies of the environmental movement in the global north. And many environmentalists in the global north, not enough, but many are now realizing it's great that we got this Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and all this stuff. We're cleaning up our environment. Unfortunately, that may mean that we're sending some of our most toxic industries into other nations. So these changes have increased, in terms of the regulations, they've increased the cost of waste management and treatment and disposal for the north, clearly giving us incentive to send this south. Second factor comes as no surprise, the widespread desire for fiscal relief among southern nations. This need, as we know, long-rooted in a history of colonialism and contemporary loan debt arrangements, often leads government officials to accept financial compensation in exchange for looking the other way while people dump chemical wastes in their borders. Third driving force is the seemingly inexorable logic of global capitalism, economic globalization. This is a logic that dictates that industries must cut costs and increase profits or simply fail. This means that toxic wastes will then be traded and dumped in nations and regions where, as a result of unstable states and/or vulnerable economies, pricing will simply be more profitable to waste management firms and brokers. Fourth and related reason for the global waste trade is an ideology within northern communities and institutions that views toxic dumping on low-income communities of color as perfectly acceptable, even necessary. This ideology is best exemplified in the infamous internal World Bank memo authored, or at least signed off on, by Lawrence Summers, then chief economist and vice president of the World Bank, now, of course, chief economic advisor to Mr. Obama. The following are excerpts. Quote, and this is from December 12, 1991. Shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging, in capital letters, more migration of the dirty industries to the lesser developed countries? Well, I can think of two reasons. He actually thought of three. I'm going to give you just two. A given amount, the other one is just absurd. Number one, a given amount of health impairing pollution, a given amount of health impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think, Summers continues, the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. Second, the concern over a pollutant that causes a 1 in a million change in the odds of prostate cancer is obviously going to be much higher in a country where people actually survive to get prostate cancer than in a country with higher mortality rates, end quote. No need for analysis. Responding to Summers' memo and to the general practice of global environmental racism, West African scholar and anthropologist Mutombo Mpanya writes, quote, one day an official from Rodell Development Incorporated was asked to comment on the possible health hazards in its toxic waste shipment bound for the great nation of Liberia and what risk this might pose to the indigenous population. This official responded, quote, if anything happens to the Africans because of the waste, well, that's too bad. That's not our problem, end quote. Mpanya continues, basically then, the policies of industrial countries are designed to turn the lands of Africa and other third world nations into landfills, the garbage dumps of prosperous industrial powers, in order to keep the Western world beautiful, end quote. So that's what one scholar has to say about this. How do social movements fit into this story? Well, in the literature on transnational social movements, which is what I'm primarily concerned about here, there's this one blind spot of relevance that I'd like to focus on. And that is that race and racism are all but totally absent as motivating factors in the development of transnational collective action, in the conceptualization of globalization, in the thing that we would call the transnational political process, in the development of a global civil society. Again, given how deeply racialized many domestic and transnational social movement struggles are, this is fairly surprising. And when I say racialized or racialization, I mean when something has a racial meaning attached to it. All right. For example, a recent book, that will remain nameless, presents case studies of transnational movement campaigns targeting female foot binding in China environmental activism among ethnic groups in the global South, and anti-slavery campaigns in the United States and the UK. It's quite surprising that, considering how clearly racialized each of these issues and campaigns are, or were, certainly at the transnational level, that analysis by social movement theorists tends to neglect what I think is a significant factor of race. One of the most important tasks that transnational environmental justice activists engage in is producing collective action frames. Any activist movement has done this, defining the problem of environmental injustice, defining solutions. Annie Leonard of the Global Anti-Incinerator Alliance, she's one of the US-based activists who visited Mozambique to work with Lingo. She sees racism as a major factor behind global environmental inequalities. She tells me, quote, "A driving force for this is simply, I think, international environmental racism." Remember the Lawrence Summers memo, David? Because there is no other justification I can think of for the fact that people are not willing to afford children in other countries the same level of environmental protection that we do in this country, end quote. Nityanand Jayaraman, who's an Indian activist and journalist, argued that neither race nor class should be privileged in dissecting the driving forces behind the global dumping and trade of hazardous waste, because both operate simultaneously. He told me, quote, "Absolutely, race and class discrimination are to blame. You see, there is an unwritten code that justifies development for some at the cost of others, usually people of color or people from disadvantaged communities or classes," end quote. In that same conversation, Jayaraman also located domestic, and he was specifically talking about India, domestic class, ethnic, and political divides as a critical factor in the production of transnational and global environmental inequality, something that we observe in many nations. So environmental inequalities are the product of multiple scales and forms of hierarchy that are layered and intersecting. So the questions of race, class, and national inequalities are actually quite critical to developing the movement's frames that articulate the problems and possible solutions. And in my opinion, this suggests that these frames are racialized, as are the mobilizing structures. Movement scholars argue that transnational social movements facilitate the development of this thing that we call global civil society by providing many local and national social movement groups around the world with access to leverage and power in relation to their national and subnational governments that they would not ordinarily have. And while I have seen this in action and certainly know that it's true to a great extent, many scholars may overstate the level of affinity and solidarity that exists between activist groups from the global North and the global South. The hopes for global civil society, if there is such a thing, must be tempered by the experiences of local and indigenous groups battling racism not only from corporations and states, but yes, from within environmental communities themselves. Activists from the global South often have seen their goals and vision of social change take a back seat to the directives and agendas of northern groups, and this presents and produces conflict and distrust, and anyone who's studied the international NGO community wouldn't be surprised by this. Many global South NGO, that is non-governmental organization leaders, resent the control that northern groups freely exercise over aid and grants that are made to activist organizations in the South. There, of course, are also numerous examples in which groups in the global North cut deals with states and corporations to displace native peoples from their lands in order to create nature preserves, environmentally conscious fantasy spaces, if you will, over the objectives of local leaders. And if you've read the brand new hot-off-the-press book by Mark Dowie called Conservation Refugees, and of course Mark David Spence's work, Dispossessing the Wilderness, we find that, guess what, this is actually the history of pretty much the national parks movement globally, whether we're talking about the United States, Africa, or Asia. Ojibwe leader and Minnesota native Winona LaDuke recently wrote about this. Quote, "Some call it environmental colonialism. Others call it plain old racism and privilege. But the underlying problem is often quite basic, revolving around historic views of who should control the land, perceptions of native peoples, and ideas about how now endangered ecosystems should be managed." End quote. Kenyan NGO leader James Shikwati stated bluntly, quote unquote, "I do not need white NGOs to speak for me. These protest voices from the global South starkly echo U.S. environmental justice activist, the late great Dana Alston's famous words, quote, "We speak for ourselves," end quote. This became a rallying cry for the United States environmental justice movement after numerous tensions erupted between activists of color and their white brothers and sisters in the environmental movement over a host of cultural conflicts and disagreements over the distribution of movement resources in the 80s and 90s. This is why it's important. I'm just going to say it plainly. These sentiments reveal that inequalities between North and South, that inequalities between the NGO communities by race, threaten to undermine the very goals of the movement. Period. So political opportunity structures are also racialized. Transnational political opportunity structures. By opportunity structures, I generally mean the degree to which states, the degree to which governments are generally receptive or not to movement demands. Modernization theory pervades the literature on transnational social movements and frankly pervades much of the international NGO community. And is in essence, this is a gross simplification, but one of the essence of modernization theory is the position that developing or pre-industrial nations are in need of assistance and guidance from the developed and industrialized states. And this viewpoint, unfortunately, ignores the hundreds of years of underdevelopment, conscious and deliberate underdevelopment of the South by the North, as labor and natural resources were and continue to this day to be exploited for the benefit of colonizers in a process that was legitimated by overtly racist ideological perspectives. Yet today, many scholars of social movements and globalization seem unaware of this history. While analyzed in terms of class, perhaps cultural and gender divides, global inequalities are rarely framed as also about racial inequality. Moreover, in the literature on transnational social movements, there is, I think it's safe to say, a disturbing, if not creeping assumption that global South governments are inherently corrupt and beset by colonialism, while ignoring parallel practices in the North, leading to what some observers have argued is a viewpoint that the erosion of state sovereignty in the North by powerful corporations and other forces is something to be steadfastly guarded against, while erosion of state power in global South nations might actually be conducive to greater democratization. So this point of view, as you can imagine, may be deeply problematic for social movements in the South who are often already suspicious of the motives of Northern activists. It was certainly something that many activists I interviewed from the North and the South were deeply concerned about. So political opportunities are indeed racialized. So what's a movement to do? What are social movements to do? Well, here I want to return back to legal scholars Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres and their concept of political race, because it offers a vision of politics that advocates coalitions, coalitions that explicitly begin with race and then move to class, gender, and perhaps nation and other social categories without ever losing sight of race. They argue that progressive cross-racial coalitions can emerge when whites engage more directly with race and, yes, for their part, when people of color actually embrace a broader vision of social justice themselves. So it cuts both ways. In Lingo's case, in my estimation, they were able to move forward with their struggle because their foreign allies, their visiting allies from other countries, Greenpeace, the Global Anti-Incinerator Alliance, the Environmental Justice Networking Forum, acknowledged the race and class violence of global pesticide dumping. They acknowledged the racism embodied in the environmental impact assessment. It was only written in English and that purported to find no risk to public health associated with an incinerator that would produce dioxins. And they acknowledged the history and the ongoing contemporary landscape of inequalities between northern and southern non-governmental organizations. In fact, shortly after this, Lingo was invited to become a part of Gaia, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, which, like several other recently emerged human rights and environmental justice global networks that I studied in this book, has explicitly organized its leadership and its governance and its action at every level around the idea of equal power sharing among global North and Global South, United States, Western Europe, Japan, and the South, explicitly organizing governance around race, class, gender, and region. Finally, Lingo itself was always a multiracial organization from the very beginning, with white and black Mozambicans founding the group and forming its core leadership. So, let's return to the two guiding questions that I began with. First, how and why does race matter in environmental politics and policy? Here I want to draw on the work of philosopher Charles Mills, who himself draws on historical text to connect racism to cultural, legal, and psychological frameworks that link images and ideas of people of color with barbarism, with filth, with dirt, with promiscuity, with pollution in all of its manifestations. The link between despised peoples and symbols associated with nature, such as disease, danger, filth, and primitive and the savage, is common in our history. It's common in our literature, and it's certainly common within contemporary politics around the globe, whether one is speaking of Africans or African Americans, indigenous peoples, Asians, Latin Americans, Jews, Roma, or Dalits. Like Mills, environmental philosopher Robert Higgins identifies some cultural sources of meanings of racial and social pollution, and that the spaces, the very environments where these despised minorities and people of color may be living are seen as quote-unquote appropriately polluted spaces. Racial segregation at work and at home, insofar as it generates perceptions of populations, of human beings themselves, as contaminants, as pollutants, facilitates the relegation of pollution to these already socially polluted spaces. So Mills and Higgins, therefore, provide a framework for the cultural logic and prevalence of environmental racism as a de facto policy of states and corporations managing modern waste streams. Finally, the second question, why does race matter for social movements? Well, historically, many social movements that ignore the realities of race and racism run the risk of inherently limiting their reach, their power, their efficacy. And the U.S. women's movement, the U.S. labor movement, and the U.S. environmental movement are poster childs, exhibit A, for this very problem. The environmental justice movement in the United States didn't just emerge because there was just this disproportionate pollution in their neighborhoods, but it also emerged because there was this blind spot, there was this refusal on the part of the mainstream movement to even take issues of class and race and gender seriously. When these movements and others do make these connections, they often produce much more powerful critiques of inequality, represent greater threats to elites, and therefore offer hope for the possibility of transformative social change. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.